Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So, let me just double check. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, everyone, for having us here tonight. Like I mentioned before, my name is Andrea Fernández, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Toronto Youth Cabinet.
My name is Ninar Fawal, and I'm the Newcomer lead at the Toronto Youth Cabinet.
And before this starts, I think it's really important to sort of socially situate ourselves, especially in regards to this conversation. This is a particularly exciting opportunity for me because, I came to Canada with my family from Venezuela when I was 10 years old and had big dreams about civic engagement. So, here we are. Yeah, sure. Oh, that's much better. Thank you.
And me, myself, I immigrated here 5 years ago from the United Arab Emirates. And that's, I think, a big part of the reason why I relate to a lot of this and why I'm really passionate about this work as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. So just some context setting. Why is this work important outside of, the moral imperative around, ensuring that we have targeted interventions that are providing adequate services for newcomer youth. By 2036, 30% of Canada's population will be made up of immigrants, and this is inclusive of, different categories of entry and status into the country. In particular for youth, when we look at grade 9 to grade 12 students in the Toronto District School Board, 42% of them were born outside of Canada. And then this last statistics, when it comes to labor market outcomes, 20% of those aged 15 to 24 reported the highest unemployment rate in Canada when we compare it to 8% of the rest of the population in that age group. So the Toronto Youth Cabinet is an advocacy body that's based within the City of Toronto. We have various profiles, including, education, the Newcomer Working Group, employment and equity, amongst other policy areas. And during the 2017-2018 term, the Newcomer Youth Working Group was formed in order to create a unique space for us as youth to think about, the specific challenges that newcomers were facing. We know that newcomers, even adults, experience a lot of barriers when it comes to accessing employment and when it comes to accessing things like health services. And, for us, it was particularly important to really take in the unique experiences of youth. And so we went out across different, areas of the city and held consultations with youth in partnership with organizations that they typically either volunteer with or access services from. And our conversations were mainly focused around education, transit, civic engagement, and then access to community services. So in regards to education, you can see in that slide some of the, direct quotes from our conversations with youth. The main finding here really was about the language barrier, right? So, them being in a vulnerable spot because they couldn't, communicate with their peers and their teachers in order to articulate their needs or even begin to articulate their needs in a new society. Here, they really stressed the importance of having healthy relationships with their teachers, being able to access a caring adult that, was aware of their experience, aware of potentially the area they'd come from, the sort of experience that they had, and could have open and honest conversations with them about it. And so, this piece was where they really identified that something was missing, that they didn't, at times feel like there was that caring adult in the space to really tap into what they recently gone through. And then some of them talked about the quality of their ESL classes. The input was varied, but one of the things that we found is that being separated from the rest of their peers in order to access English as a second language courses was particularly isolating for them, right? They were already different, and being pulled out of their regular classes, when you're a high school student, you kind of just want to fit in. And so, this experience wasn't almost like letting them go under the radar, like it was really accentuating their difference. In terms of civic engagement, varying perspectives here, we found overall that this was a really opinionated group. If you engaged them in the right way and really tapped into their experiences, there was no shortage in their ability and willingness to share. But of course, the Toronto Youth Cabinet is situated in City Hall, and so it's not the most accessible of spaces when you're talking about a 15-year-old that may potentially, be interested in being more civically engaged. And then another piece here too was the confusion around the different levels of government. So in their initial experience of coming to Canada, they may have interacted with the federal government, but then in, say, elections campaigns, they may have seen a poster for an MPP, and a potential city councillor may have come knocking at their door. But it felt as though, and even students who had gone through the grade 10 civics course, that there was confusion around divisions of power and how the different levels of government interact together in order to serve as newcomers. We talked about transit and community services, and this was the area where so many unique ideas really came up. Where they were detailing their experiences of accessing transit on a daily basis, and the barriers when it comes to accessing information in your language to get from place A to place B. In terms of like navigating a bit of a complex system when you're starting out, was something that they identified. And then, I'll leave it to Ninar to sort of highlight some of the ideas that they had, but that's at a high level what we heard.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges we faced. So the primary challenge we faced was outreach. So we operate out of City Hall, which is already a bit kind of inaccessible for young people, let alone newcomer youth. So in a lot of the instances where we tried to conduct consultations, we had to reach out to the organizations directly as opposed to relying on social media or any kind of other outreach forms we'd usually do. So we'd kind of find a settlement worker, we'd have them promise us that they'd bring X amount of youth to the consultation. So outreach was a bit difficult, but on the bright side, the successes we had was that when the newcomer youth showed up to these consultations, they were very, very opinionated, like Andrea said, very passionate in a lot of the cases of what we were talking about. And what made me really happy is that at the end of every consultation, almost everyone would be really interested in joining the cabinet itself because it's open to all youth. There was an instance, for example, where we took them to council chambers, which is where the mayor and the councillors sit, and they got to sit in like the mayor's chair, and they're really cute. They're like grade 9s. It's really, yeah, it was a really cool experience. In terms of next steps for us, because we're the newest working group at the Toronto Youth Cabinet, this has kind of been phasing out what we want to do in coming years. So we talked to newcomer youth. We got a sense of what they're passionate about, what they care about. So it's terms of like implementing what initiatives you want to tackle in the coming years. So we've had really cool ideas like apps and websites, and I know you will like this community here will like this, because a lot of them are young, and the solutions they came up with tend to involve apps and websites and technology. So we heard of things as having an app for transit, but in different languages so they can access transit more easily, or having more settlement workers in their school because they feel isolated in school sometimes, especially high schools. So I think this would interest Civic Tech Toronto a lot, because like I said, a lot of them are thinking of apps and website development, and they're interested in themselves. So yeah, that's what we have on our end. I'm gonna open up the floor to any questions. We can start here. Do you want the? Okay, sure.
Is there enough numbers and interest for the Toronto Youth Cabinet that you can start doing things at the community council level?
In terms of like city council?
Right. That's an interesting question. So it's something that we've explored in the past, but as an organization, we haven't taken the pulse of interest formally through the different wards and different areas of the GTA. But if there is an opportunity, and if it is a sort of data-driven initiative that we could undertake, we'd be happy to continue the conversation. Right.
Accessibility has been a concern before, because we operate in City Hall in terms of, it's easy for us as a cabinet because we are all young people, and it's a bit difficult to kind of harness all the resources we need sometimes. But definitely that's something that's been brought up before. And even with consultations like this, if we'd have them at City Hall, newcomer youth wouldn't really like that because it's inaccessible to them. Right. So definitely in the future, we're looking to expand.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do at the cabinet is that we provide free tokens for folks that come out to our meetings. And for 2 of the consultations, we went into communities in order to have these conversations. But I think that there's more that can be done to increase access. Yeah.
You had said briefly there that City Hall wasn't really accessible for younger audiences. Now, this might be me being ignorant, not growing up in the city as a young kid. But why is that? How come the City Hall isn't accessible? You'd think walking into a business or an office or a tower or whatnot would be more daunting than City Hall.
I would say it's more in the symbolic sense, well, at least recently. So recently, literally, they've installed kind of security in City Hall, which has not been there before. So that's already in and of itself intimidating. But before we even had the security there, symbolically it would be difficult to walk in to a building, or at least this is what we've heard. And when I was 14 and I joined the youth cabinet, it was kind of scary for me to walk into City Hall and just, because we don't often get the space given to us like that as young people. So to be a newcomer youth and maybe perhaps have a language barrier or not be familiar with the city, or most of them don't even live downtown, I would say it's more of kind of a mutual understanding that a lot of newcomer youth aren't comfortable with entering City Hall. Not saying that it's like physically inaccessible or anything like that, but just it's an
emotionally,
atmosphere.
mentally.
I think it's a perception thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's a large, it's a government institution, and I think in the civic engagement part of the conversation that really came out where it was almost as if to come out to the City Hall consultation, they all had to be on their best behavior. But that's not what we wanted. We wanted an open and honest conversation. And so we were very adamant when we were engaging with them, in that space, to really make them feel comfortable, to really sort of, tone it down and make the language super accessible. So that was the case.
Yeah.
It might be something to take a look at too, and making it more accessible in regards to that.
Definitely.
Have it so that it's like, it's a welcoming, because it's your government.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, that's just me.
there was an instance where, there was a consultation where a counselor dropped in, and most of them were in the high school age, and they were so unbelievably happy. Like, not even happy, just like in awe that like a counselor came in and said hi to us and kind of sat with us for a bit, and he was the friendliest person ever. And they, I don't know, they felt very kind of ambitious after that, very excited. Yeah. Sorry, any more questions?
Does Toronto Youth Cabinet meet in other places as well, like to account kind of for these feelings, and what are those other spaces?
Like we said, capacity-wise, we unfortunately have not been able to. We hold a lot of events like all throughout the city, but in terms of our monthly general cabinet meetings, they happen at City Hall. If in the future, it's not looking like it, but if it's in the future, we kind of have the ability to harness more resources, or we would possibly look into meeting like Scarborough or in Etobicoke or North York or whatnot. But in the future, hopefully, definitely.
Hi, this isn't a question, it's a comment. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a service designer. I've interviewed all kinds of people in many parts of the world, actually, to ask them what they're looking for in services. And I just wanted to say, I think you guys have done a really good job. I mean, you mentioned a lot of barriers, but you've done a great job of getting past the barriers to collect some really interesting insights about youth in Toronto.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, you had a question? Yes, you want to the mic?
So what do you guys do with the ideas that you are generated?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So right now we've mostly explored our sort of traditional formal advocacy routes. So we've developed a briefing note that has been posted on our site that is going to be adopted into the next term as sort of, this is the TYC's position when it comes to gaps in services for newcomer youth, and here's what we're advocating for. And some of the key things that we highlighted were accessible mental health supports in schools, after school academic guidance programs, and then more accessible guidance counselors in elementary and secondary schools.
And we also have a lot of great connections with counselors in City Council. So because we're relatively new, the first thing we did as a newcomer working group was meet with Councillor Nithan Shan. So he was the city's old newcomer advocate, and he was very, very excited about going through the policy route or kind of introducing motions in City Council and routes like that as well. So so we kind of outlined the concerns right now. We're kind of mapping out how to tackle them or how to set forth initiatives that will address them.
Ooh, hello. Test,
Hi.
test. Hello. I'm Evelyn. Hi. So you mentioned earlier about having people coming into the city hall is inaccessible because they're all living in different places in the city. What are some of the ways that you guys engage them, not physically, but like remotely, maybe over the internet, like you mentioned earlier with web and apps? And what are some of the ways that are currently being done to have that outreach further through technology?
So not in particular for the newcomer youth consultations, but for other work that we've recently done. I can think of, we had an Ask Us Anything session that was a live virtual session for folks to engage them in the application process for the next term. And I think that's, one way in which we're really thinking about how do we engage youth that aren't just in the downtown core. In terms of our working groups, a lot of activity happens online. So we use Slack a lot. We have a channel for all of our working groups. So we really keep the conversations going there because we only meet as a cabinet once a month with all our working groups. And so a lot of the activity really happens in between those meetings. But again, I think this is an area where, we're happy to take a look at your suggestions and see, how else we can engage youth.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't see any more questions. I am going to take the Master of Ceremonies privilege and ask the last question then. I just wondered if you were doing something, if the Youth Cabinet was doing something to foster a dialogue between Indigenous, as in First Nations youth, and newcomer youth.
No, we are currently not doing that. So this this term, we culminated this work by having a newcomer youth open dialogue event. So this was where we brought newcomer youth from all parts of the city to talk about their common challenges. But I think that's such an interesting opportunity to look at in the future and see if we can bring those two groups together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.